Christian, in week one I was talking about the various technologies that developed at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century to record and play back sound. What was important in those and the way in which sound is represented in that kind of recording?
Well, in those technologies you were talking about, they're what we term analog technologies. Analog technologies try and represent sound in an analogous way to the original sound, and they do so by storing the information in some kind of smooth and continuous fashion. For example, a vinyl record has grooves which are a physical analog to the real-world waveform.
Right, I see. But in the mid to late 20th century, digital technology appeared on the scene and quickly became the industry standard for recording and distributing music. What's the difference?
Well, whereas analog audio technology stores the sound as a physical analog to the real world sound, so it's smooth and continuous representation, digital audio is actually a discrete representation. So measurements of the sound wave are taken at regular time intervals. So we're not actually storing the whole wave as such, as you would in, say, analog. You're storing measurements over a specific period of time. In short, you're not actually recording everything, so some information is lost.
Right, but I mean, there are distinct technologies, distinct devices that are involved in stages in digital recording process. What are they?
Well, the main two pieces of technology are what's called an analog to digital converter and a digital to analog converter. An analog to digital converter takes those measurements at regular time intervals and stores them at what are called samples. The samples are basically a measure of the amplitude and are stored as a binary digit or bit. Once they're stored, you obviously want to play them back. So we run them into what's called a DAC, or the digital to analog converter, and that converts those discrete measurements back from a stepped waveform or a square waveform into a smooth continuous waveform, the same as you have with analog audio.
Right, well, you've been working with digital audio for a long time. What would you say are the critical factors that people need to consider in digital audio?
Well, the main two critical factors I would say are the sampling rate and the bit depth. The sampling rate determines the number of measurements or samples of the waveform's amplitude taken in any given second, and the bit depth determines the quality of each of those samples or measurements. And the important thing the sampling rate deals with effectively is what we call the frequency range that particular digital process can record, and the bit depth determines the quality of the dynamic range and also, I guess, the distance between the good signal and the noise within the system.
Well, in terms of sampling rate and bit depth, what are the things that people really need to know about that?
Well, I guess the two key things to note that way back in the 80s, Sony and Philips decided that the base standard sampling rate and bit depth would be 44,100 samples per second, usually measured in hertz, and the bit depth would be 16 bits. Now that was for the compact disc, and that was going to be used by domestic music listeners and audio consumers. That standard's continued on to this day, at least for base level listening for the home user, but for the professional users, such as the users in our course, I recommend using a sampling rate of 48,000 samples per second and 24-bit.
So these are things we're going to look at in more depth in the next part of our course.
Absolutely.